You know we've got five senses, right? Touch, taste, smell, sight, hearing, thank you. Five senses. Then occasionally you get the person who comes up to you and says, I have a sixth sense, okay? These are people who claim to know stuff that they wouldn't otherwise know, typically. It turns out if you take those people and put them in the laboratory, the sixth sense just simply goes away under controlled circumstances. So either the sixth sense is this shy thing that doesn't lend itself to investigation, or it just doesn't exist at all, and we've duped ourselves into believing you had this power.
For example, you could say, what's the shape of the Earth? You say, well, it's a sphere. You say, well, no, it's not quite a sphere. It's a little wider at the equator than at the poles. Okay, so it's a little squashed sphere. There's a word for that, two words, oblate spheroid. And then you say, well, okay, it's not quite that, actually, because it's slightly wider below the equator than at the equator. So in fact, the Earth is kind of pear-shaped. So that's the shape of the Earth. But how pear-shaped is it? If you held Earth out here and looked at it, if you used Earth as a model for a cue ball in a pool table, it would be the smoothest cue ball anyone ever made. So these variations from equator to pole and from below the equator to the equator are actually so small that it would make no difference to you if I handed you that sphere with that shape. You would not be able to feel it and tell the difference. So that's kind of interesting. So there's no right or wrong answer here. It's a conversation about what the shape of the Earth is. Not enough of that goes on in the science classroom. And because we are seduced by the right answer rather than by the journey to the answer. The forces that influenced me were not so much forces that influenced me, but forces that I sought out so that I could align them with what my interests were. So often that question presumes I'm there not knowing anything, and then people direct me. No, I was self-directed from the beginning. And so then you can ask, well, do you have any role models, right? No, because at my age, at that time, had I required that there be a black person from the Bronx who grew up and then became an astrophysicist, I would have never become an astrophysicist. So one of the shortcomings of role models is that it requires that you be what somebody else has already become, rather than carve a new path that's never been carved before. And so instead what I did was I assembled my role model in pieces and then stapled them together, and that became my role model.
Now, I've been brought into some of that conversation just to help people understand what science is and what science is not. And so I think what's unfortunate about how that's turned is religion is becoming sort of the enemy of science, or science the enemy of religion. And that's only because religious forces are trying to put religious writings in the science classroom. Now, there's no tradition of the science professor knocking down the door of the Sunday school telling the preacher to put science in what goes on in the Sunday school class. There's no tradition of that. There are no scientists picketing outside of churches saying, equal time for Darwin. That doesn't happen. It's not how this country was founded. So it's this needless debate going on out there when people need to know if your belief system derives from what's called inspired truths that do not come out of empirical investigation of the physical world, it has no place in the science classroom. That doesn't mean it has no place anywhere else. Put it in the religious philosophy class. Put it in the history of human thought class. But it just has no place in the science classroom.
The goal here is not to make everybody a scientist. That's not the goal. What a boring world that would be. You want artists, you want musicians, you want novelists, poets, comedians, actors. You want the rest of this. What matters is whether they're scientifically literate and maintain that literacy and that curiosity throughout their lives, in no matter what becomes their profession. Kids are born scientists. You don't have to turn them on to investigating the world around them. They do that coming out of the womb. Kids turn over rocks and poke at the millipedes. They pick apart flowers. They bang on pots and pans. They will do things that are experiments in the world around them. And so the challenge is not getting kids interested in exploring the world around them. The challenge is staying out of their way. How many parents do you know, when the kid drags the pots and pans out of the cabinet, how many of them say, stop doing that, you're making a racket and you're getting the dishes and pots dirty, put them back. They just squashed an entire experiment in acoustics. At least that's how I look at it. That's the kids exploring. So the trick is to get out of their way. And people do become scientists even when they have boring science teachers. Those, I think, are kids who never lost their curiosity for nature. And you're right, there's some classes where it gets squashed. The enthusiasm is drummed out of them. So you got to put in some ways to keep it going. I don't have a problem with that. You put in some ways, and we would continue to go back to the museum. I took classes at the Hayden Planetarium. Later on, I was a member of the Amateur Astronomers Association of New York. I had a telescope. We went to meetings, went to star parties. So I had ways to sustain it. And they were all sort of self-driven because I had the interest cast upon me by the universe when I was 9 years old.
There's about 6,500 astrophysicists in the world. It's not very many, actually. It's just, a few thousand. And there's about 6.5 billion people in the world. So if you divide those two numbers, you get 1 in a million. So, no, what I mean, now the point of that exercise is, if you ever find yourself in the company of an astrophysicist, that's your chance to ask the question. Because you never know when that's going to happen again. The actual content of a black hole has collapsed to what we call the singularity. That's where, in Einstein's theories, we divide by zero. It's bad to divide by zero. So, Einstein's theories fail at the center of a black hole. That's why we know there's something beyond Einstein's theories. There's got to be. If the universe is a knowable, organized place, Einstein's theories have a limit, and that's the singularity. It'll get you right up to it, but it won't get you there. Meanwhile, the operational definition of a black hole is the region of space around it, within which, if you fall, you will never come back out. And we call that, poetically, the event horizon. Love that. The event horizon. I kind of feel you shouldn't, once you go and you never come out, it should be like the death horizon, the Death Star. But it's not the event horizon. So when we think of the size of a black hole, it's not the size of the matter that occupies it. It's just the region of space where if you cross that boundary, there is no hope of ever coming out because the fabric of the universe has curved back on itself, and there's no trajectory you can take to get out of that region. Light can't even get out. That's why we call them black. And light is the fastest thing we know, so you're not coming out. So what you think makes sense has nothing to do with reality. It just has to do with your life experience. And your life experience may only be a small smidgen of reality, possibly even a distorted account of reality at that. So, what this means is, beginning in the 20th century, as our means of decoding nature became more and more and more powerful, we started realizing our common sense is no longer a tool to pass judgment on whether or not a scientific theory is correct. And thus was born quantum mechanics, relativity, curved space, expanding universe. So when I tell you that the entire universe has been around and expanding for 14 billion years, you go back 14 billion years ago, the entire universe fit on the head of a pin, you're going to say, that doesn't make sense. And I'm going to say, I don't care that it doesn't make sense. The universe doesn't care that it makes sense to you. That's not its goal in life, to make sense to you. It issues forth from a whole other investigation of the behavior of matter of the large, Einstein's general theory of relativity. And then there's the shotgun wedding of the general theory of relativity, the theory of the large, with quantum mechanics. This is the physics of the small. The early universe, the large was small. And there's general relativity and quantum mechanics intersecting in a shotgun marriage. They're not otherwise compatible descriptions of the universe. This works there and this works there. Now they got to work together. We have no understanding of how they'll work together. We got top people working on it. They're called string theorists, okay? And they're still not there yet. They're still not there. They're working on it.
Who's to say that the financial collapse of the markets would not have been either completely avoided or certainly mitigated if the borrowers had the power to calculate the effect of a variable interest rate on their monthly payments? If you could do that, then you could make a decision separate from the lender and saying, nope, I can't afford this. If the interest rate fluctuates to this point, I end up having to foreclose my house. You can make that decision yourself. It's empowering. Not only that, science literacy allows you to vote in ways that provide monies for the people who are scientists to do science, because you know that innovations in science and technology are the engines of all economic growth of the future. And there's no greater engine of economic growth since the Industrial Revolution.
85% of all the gravity of the universe has a source that is completely unaccounted for. We look around at all the electrons, protons, all the favorite particles that comprise us and Earth and the sun. We find them, we know where they are. We know how to detect them. And when we do, and we look at the gravity that they exhibit, that's like 1/6 of the gravity that's actually exhibiting itself out there in the universe. We don't know what's causing it. So we have this placeholder term called dark matter. We don't know if it's matter. There are many of us who assume it for other cogent reasons, but we don't know if it's. So we could have just called it Fred, all right? It's just a placeholder term, okay? So we are completely ignorant of what accounts for this extra gravity. It's really dark gravity. That's what it is. We call it dark matter. My favorite idea, not my idea, but it's circulating, comes from the multiverse hypothesis, that we are one of many universes, which has important historical and philosophical foundations for suggesting we might be one of multiple universes. But there's no evidence for that yet. But let's go with that assumption for the moment. If there were multiple universes, they would exist in a higher dimension. So you'd have these universes coexisting with us in a higher dimension, non-intersecting. It turns out, if you do the calculation, gravity can permeate the membrane of one universe and be felt across the membrane of an adjacent universe. So it may be that what we're calling dark matter is regular matter in a parallel universe whose gravitational field we are feeling.